Thank you. It's nice to see everyone today. Thank you for joining us. And we have a nice, cozy group. And Zach, I'm assuming that you would be comfortable that if people have comments or questions to please just break in and ask them. And if you're not comfortable, please just put them in chat and we'll try to keep an eye on that throughout the presentation. And so we'll just start by introducing ourselves. I'm just thrilled and happy to know everybody. It's so nice to see you all. But my name is Jonna Ernst, and I'm at Heartland. And Zach and I have been thrilled to partner on this project along with several other faculty. And many of you don't know Zach. He's incredibly fantastic. So Zach, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you. And yes, this is not a lecture, so please pop in with questions as they occur to you. My name is Zach Petrie. I am professor of English at Heartland, and I work with, mostly for Jonna. She is the guiding light to which we just follow along. And so I'm very much a visitor in your world of ECE, and I appreciate you having me. This is fun.
I'll just point out Zach is like amazingly flattering. And so with that said, and Zach and I, during Marcus's talk, one of the things that Marcus said was that PLA in English, which, we're kind of exploring some of the things that we're going to talk about with regard to this. What was the remarkably uncommon, I believe, is the phrase that he used. So some of the things that we're going to embed are just some of the initial steps that we've used in kind of percolating around this. Zach has been a fantastic leader in kind of thinking through these different issues and connecting to just really key people at the college. I just also wanted to point out we have two other people from Heartland who are joining us, and a lot of these just initiatives have required a lot of new processes and various kind of novel lifts. Teresa Walker has done recruitment and retention and it really had to do a lot of recruitment for these initiatives. So thank you. And Sarah Dean is also here. Sarah Dean is advisor extraordinaire and had to develop really brand new processes to get students into some of the novel pathways that we are talking about. So I am going to, for some reason, I have participants up on my screen. I'm going to see if I can get that down like Marcus. I love how he always prefaces putting his glasses on. I have that same kind of age issue. So can you all see that I have participants in the middle of my screen? Or are you not able to see that? Is that not distracting you? Okay, so I'll just accept it as only distracting me. So what we're going to talk about today, we did a pilot, and this is very much a descriptive design in terms of the methodology that we're going to be describing to you. But one of the things that we're doing in the fall of this year is we're replicating it. And so we're really going to try to drill down. And as we're describing these different design elements, we're really going to be trying to look at in a more meaningful way which of the elements were most effective. So just keep that in mind as we're talking, that this is very much a descriptive study. So we'll talk a little bit about outcomes and future applications and where we are right now in terms of braided assessment, which we'll talk about what that specifically means, as well as prior learning assessment, both within the context of ECE and some of what we're kind of percolating on institutionally in a broader context. With that said, we established a general education cohort for early childhood learners. And this cohort, as I mentioned, took place in the fall of last year, and the cohort was within the online environment. And what we did was we targeted particular focus courses that were part of the early childhood applied associate of science pathways. And so you can see that list of courses there. Most of them are familiar to you in terms of your own institutions. For example, English 101. I'll point out that Literature 118 is a literature class. It's children's literature, which might have unique numbering at your own institution, but that is a common elective that early childhood students take. Social 135, we included in the pathway, that is marriage and family. And the reason why we included that course in the pathway is because that is a course that leads to our family specialist credential. It's also an elective, and so that is why that course was included as well. And so some of the factors that we looked at in terms of looking at the efficacy of the model were things like student records. We conducted a variety of interviews. We conducted a variety of student services to really think about what elements of cohort design features were most effective in terms of student success. And we really had a variety of different model features that we were thinking about. Faculty, as Zach will talk about, really adapted a lot of their instructional design practices and pedagogy. We had embedded success coaches, we had tutors, and so there were a variety of different factors that came into play that we really focused on within this. And I see that there are two okay, thank you. Comments that have come up. So I just want to talk a little bit about some key questions and data collection. So some of the things that we were thinking about were, what are the individual trajectories of students in the GEC ECE pathway? And I just want to point out, I noticed this morning, not one of the probably 50 times that Zach and I proofread this, that in the second line I said CBE pathway, I should say ECE pathway. But we wanted to really look at individual trajectories of students that we'll get into a little bit more detail on later. Thinking about what was their academic history and what was unique about this particular cohort of courses in comparison to that academic history. What were the really kind of unique features and designs of this pathway associated with retention, persistence, and completion for these learners? And for which learners were these design features most effective? And one of the things that we're going to talk about is what we were really able to drill down into and answer, and what we just can't answer yet because of sample size and factors like that. And so really looking at as well, individual trajectories and student persistence. So we really used a variety of data collection strategies. So we looked at learner demographic data. We looked at a history of academic data, what credits have been transferred in, previous academic experience, how comfortable students were with online courses. That was some of the survey data we collected, their comfort and experience with technology. Again, these were online courses. And I'll just mention one of the things that we looked at, we repeated the survey over time. And so one of the things that was really interesting was the idea of what was their initial comfort with technology and how did that shift over time? And that really gave us some interesting insight into where supports should be provided. Also, learner success factors, things like GPA, courses completed, and those kinds of factors. So in terms of the overall model design, and I'm just going to describe this broadly, we used a term called braiding. And the idea of braiding is that we were looking across the whole of the learner pathway. And when we talk about this particular learning pathway, we were looking at the whole of these courses. And, there were 7 courses involved. And we were really looking at eliminating redundancies. And we all know, we think about that early childhood work where where are we introducing a topic and where are we developing and where are we assessing it? And if you'll remember when that work was initially done, maybe it was 10 years ago, the idea that what some of us found is that we were assessing things over and over again, but maybe hadn't really fully developed the topic, for example, or that we had introduced things, but maybe hadn't really fully assessed it. And so when we were looking at this cohort of classes that all the early childhood students were going through, what could we learn about where redundancies existed and where redundancies were truly meaningful and needed to exist, and where they were just redundancies that didn't need to exist. And with that said, how could we streamline pathways relative to that? And that fed into, what do we really need to do if we're looking again across this whole learning pathway? How do we really meaningfully support these learners in mastering the knowledge and skills that they need? And so we really thought about this in a macro sense. So Zach, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. Couple things that I just really want to emphasize about what she said is this was 7 instructors sitting in rooms, Zoom rooms mostly, talking about the courses and how much fun that was. And so it's pretty rare where you can get people from different disciplines to sit down and talk about the curriculum they teach in their class and those moments where they overlap. And so that was just a really fun experience to start this whole project. We came together and she kind of laid out this idea of, okay, we have this cohort and what can we do that's different from your normal class that you teach for a gen ed population? And knowing that the design was to have these kids come in, these adults, these professionals, like what would we do differently? And so from the instructor standpoint, I was just like, oh, a pig rolling around in mud going, there's so much I could do. It's so much fun. So that experience was fantastic, just to lay that out. It changed over time and we'll get there later, but just that's how we all kind of came in with how can we play with this. And so what you see on the screen here is some of those initial braids that we started to connect. And so what you see are learning outcomes, which are straight from the master syllabi from English 101, Social 135, and Child 239. So as we were looking at these moments of serendipitous connection, like, oh, hey, look, Child 239, they're supposed to be identifying resources in the community. And in my English 101, they're supposed to be practicing research methods and organizing research. Like, that's a perfect connection between our 2 classes. And we did the same thing with Social 135. And that one actually connected to both 239 and 101. And so I just wanted to highlight that there's times where some classes, those learning outcomes have direct connections. And in some cases, it's spread across multiple classes, plural. And that was just a really cool first step of what are those moments where we could talk about things that we do that relate to our own instruction. And then, John, if you could advance.
Absolutely.
This was the next step. And so after we identified those moments of connection, then we went kind of back out and we started looking at some of the bigger things. And so obviously in your world, which I'm learning just a little bit about, the Illinois ECE competency is a thing and the ECE learning outcome. So those are tied together, obviously. And then there's the assessment. So here's how this class would assess that learning outcome. And so here you can see just a little summary of the assignment that the student was doing in that class. And as I looked at the learning outcome, I said, hey, I think I've got a match there. Can I see your assignment? And she gave me the assignment. I said, oh, this assignment is fantastic. There's the learning outcome that this meets in my class. And actually in my class, I could have my students create an annotated bibliography for her assignment. And so there's this moment where they could be working in my class doing my assignment, which would then help them in Jana's class doing her assignment. And so watching those connections progress across these different courses was really fun. And like the previous slide indicated, there wasn't always a connection. Like this particular one was that connection between 239 and 101. Soc 135 didn't have that, but just the task of going through and exploring those connections was how we wanted to braid these together. So the students were coming in multiple classes, but they understood the connections and they were actually working on similar projects as they wound their way through. That's a terrible chart. I made that chart. I'm really sorry. Seeing it on the screen now, that's kind of hard to read. So apologies. Does this make sense so far before we move
Oh,
on?
I think it's super clear. Just one thing that I'll add, Zach, like this, I think the chart's really clear. It gives an example related to early childhood, but that same work was done across, and you mentioned this on the previous slide, across all of the gen ed classes as well. And so it really, was this deep thought. And, one of the things that we talked about a lot, and, Zach, as a writing instructor, it's just kind of interesting how much writing we require of our students. And the idea that, as a faculty, the idea that we probably all have proficiencies in writing because we've all attained a certain level of education where writing is expected. And so writing might be one of the first levels of assessment that occurs to us, right? Like write a maybe 2 paragraph, right? Maybe a 2 page, maybe right, maybe a 20 page, right? But is that an appropriate assessment strategy? And is that potentially a redundancy that could be eliminated? So that's kind of another layer of thinking. And we'll go into that a little bit more later. I mean, obviously, it's an incredibly important skill. But if we're measuring other skills through that over and over again, what additional challenge might we be presenting?
And I think the other fun thing about this from the instructor side, talking across disciplines, was the fact of identifying those redundancies, but then also simultaneously identifying the necessary repetitions. And so there are some skills to achieve a mastery level, you have to do them over and over again. And so being able to look and say, oh, this one definitely, it's good they're doing it in 239, 101, and 135. But then in other areas where you're like, oh, yeah, actually, maybe they don't need to do that in both of them. Maybe they could just do that in yours. But when we develop our classes in a normal semester, I'm just like blinders on, like, oh, this is my class. Here's what I'm doing in my class. Because we didn't have the discussions about, oh, these students are also taking these other classes. And so having that macro big picture trajectory of the students' actual curricular lives was really cool to experience, because unless you're a program coordinator, you don't get that very much. And even a program coordinator, it's within your discipline. So the cross-discipline nature of the ECE pathway was a really cool way to approach this whole project.
So I will just say that, that braiding, we started with this image of a pot holder. And, that was like kind of this like super fantastic, really well. My pot holders in junior high never, or, elementary school never quite looked like that. But it was like, wow, this is like crystal clear and it's going to go well. And the reality is that things were a little messy, and they were a little messy for a variety of reasons. One of which, and I mean, this is like such an obvious reason that I did not foresee. We had 25 learners in the cohort, and for whatever reason, just assumed, well, they'll be enrolled cross classes, right? And so this braiding, you have 25 learners and they're enrolled cross classes. And so the braiding of assessments will work really well. Well, of course, that wasn't the reality. We had some students that were enrolled in one class and some that were enrolled in another. So that testing of the braiding was a lot more complex than we thought. Zach, you had another really great insight about one of the complexities about the elective classes. So I wondered if you wanted to share that.
Sure. And so, as you mentioned, that literature 118, it is very common for students who are interested in ECE to take that class. But they might not always be in my English 101, or they've taken English 101 before they take the 118. And so the timing was off. And especially with adult learners who are only coming in, not taking a full load of classes, but taking just a couple classes, they're like, oh yeah, I'll do this one and that one. And then that throws off the cohort model. And so it's really nice when you, as a designer, have complete control of you will take A, B, C, D. But obviously, our learners were professionals. They had lives and families, and they were just, okay, I could do this one and this one. And so that was a interesting experience that we were like, oh, of course. Like that theory beforehand was like, oh, this would be so cool in a perfect world. And lives are messy. Lives, I couldn't make that pot holder either. So yeah.
So we can learn lives are messy, that lesson over and over again. Still, we got some great data. So just in terms of general information, and I'm just going to comment that I still have the chat. So I'm well in touch with the chat because it's exactly in the middle of my screen. And so if a number comes up, I might pause for a minute, and then Zach, you can just yell out whatever number I can no longer see. So when we look at just some of the general information of what we knew about our learners. In comparison, we know that in general, the AA students did perform lower from historical data when compared to the AAS students in general education classes, and that English and Psych 101 were courses of significant challenge. And one of the things that we really spent a lot of time thinking about was, of course, those are classes that are required at level 3. So that was another kind of layer of meaning. And with Psych 101 as an option, but that was kind of another layer of important meaning behind this work that we were doing, that in terms of supporting successful progression through credentials, we really wanted to spend a lot of time meaningfully thinking about how to support progression. So there were 25 learners, as I mentioned earlier, and 39 courses were previously enrolled in by 18 students. And of those courses, there was a 74% pass rate. 50% of those students had passed each course that they were enrolled in. And as I mentioned earlier, Psych and English 101 were the courses that students were most likely to struggle in, with historic pass rates, 53% for AA and 58% for AAS students. And this is adjusted based on sample size. And then historic pass rates in Psych 101, as you can see, is 55% for AA and 57%, slightly over, for AAS students. So if we look at the results overall, and Zach, I'm going to ask again, because of where my chat is located and my complete inability to move it, if you would please take this slide over.
Sure. So the results from this, first, the previous slide, I'm an English teacher, right? So I'm used to those low pass rates in English 101. The students that come to us at the community college level have complicated lives, messy realities. And so please don't feel like any of that was saying this is bad for the teachers. Psych 101 and English 101 and math are very common with this. And so having this project was another reason of trying to address how could we improve those numbers. And as you're going to see by the green, because green is good, yay, we did improve some of this retention and data. And so as you're going to see here, 50% of the students had previously passed to the courses. And in this case, it was 87%. So it was a really significant improvement. It's a small N, so the numbers we understand are a small sample size, but that is just a really high improvement that we were really proud to see. The pass rates, as she mentioned before, were in the 50s. And for the fall 22 cohort, it went into the mid 60s. And so again, a very strong improvement. Psych 101 was upper 50s, and it ended up being 84%. So overall, the retention rates increased significantly and drastically through our projects. Obviously, we are very cognizant of the students that were enrolling in this. They knew it was a pilot, it was the first time, and that's going to kind of get you a certain kind of student. And so also you have teachers who are trying this for the first time, and so that's going to get a certain amount of attention from us. So there's a lot of variables, the effective stuff that we can't identify and quantify, but overall we were really pleased with the results of this, just to say like something worked here. And so what could we replicate? And our first idea was, oh, it works so well in fall, let's do it again in spring of 23. And then it was like, oh, wait, that's not enough time to actually like from the data start disaggregating and analyzing the data to figure out what actually was it that helped and what wasn't as useful as we thought it was. And so that was one of the reasons we pushed back the next one into fall of 23, is we needed that time to actually decompress and look at what we found from the fall of 22.
And thank you so much, Zach. One thing that I will just briefly add, so we did utilize a chi-square analysis for these, and so it did account for sample size. The Psych 101 and English 101 had, Psych 101 had an average class size. English 101 had a slightly below average class size. The only class that had a significantly smaller class size where we just couldn't really run meaningful analysis was Com 101. And so I'll just mention that briefly. Com 101, interestingly, also had the highest pass rates when compared to the highest historical pass rates when compared to each of the other classes. So I'm just going to pause for a moment here to see if anybody has any comments. And again, if you're comfortable, just unmuting and chiming in.
I'm wondering, I mean, this may be obvious, but I'm curious what you attribute the increase for, the success, or their like, is it the tutors, the success coaches, or the curriculum itself?
It was me.
Well, thank you, Teresa Walker. Yeah, it was Zach. So we're going to go into a little bit more talking about what the specific factors were. And as Zach pointed out, it's hard to drill down at this point. So this is very much descriptive right now, right? Like right now we know. And then when we replicate this in the fall of 2023, hopefully we'll be able to be a little bit more experimental in our design as opposed to descriptive, and be able to answer that question in a meaningful way. But that's a great question. That's a great question. Yeah.
That was the best non-answer answer ever. That was fantastic.
I don't know. Any other questions before we go on?
Is it typical that the AAS students outperform the AA students in English and Psych?
So I think that's a great question, Marilyn. And when we were looking at the historical data, and again, we adjusted for sample size. We were just looking at clean, adjusted data. That was something that surprised me. So is it typical? It's what the data told us. So,
and we're not sure whether it's statistically. Sorry, and you're just looking at the raw percentage data. I don't know if we've looked at whether it's a statistically significant difference between the 55% and the 57% is one kind of caution. And she's so good at data, she probably knows that answer. And then the other hand, the other side of my brain is like, well, of course it would be a little bit better because those people are enrolling in that pathway for specifically like goal-oriented purposes. And so you also have some good adult learners. And so the adult learners plus the idea that people have a goal in mind always makes them a little bit better as students as far as like national numbers go. It's those gen ed students that are here because they don't know that always struggles statistically, like because they don't have that goal in mind. So I'm not surprised if that is actually true.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So it was
That's-
young freshmen versus more older, more mature adult learners?
We looked at comparison via pathway. And so some of the other data that we collected, so we looked at early childhood versus CTE. And so if we looked at CTE pathways in general, CTE pathway, individuals who were enrolled in CTE pathways struggled a little bit more in English and psych writ large when compared to, so we pulled apart the data by every major, we pulled it apart by sectors of the college, we pulled it apart by the AA pathway, we pulled it apart by the AAS pathway. We learned, as was shared in the in an earlier slide, that early childhood students tended to struggle a little bit more in their general education classes, which was one of the reasons that why we thought this learning pathway investigation was so meaningful. Other comments or questions? Marilyn, did that address your question?
Well, in this case, they did not. The
Right. And so
ECE
when
did
compared,
not struggle more in this.
correct. And so that was one of the things we were
Right.
specifically looking at, was like, oh, would this help that student? And so I think that was a thing that showed something we did worked. We just got to figure out which of the things we did work.
Yeah, and that's a great point. Thank you. And I was talking about the historical data. So yeah, thank you for highlighting that. So in terms of instructional strategies and design, we're going to talk now about some of the specific things that we did. So we really thought a lot about learner supports. And so based on unique learner needs, the idea that we put a lot of intensive supports that were included at the beginning of the course. And Zach, if you want to kind of take over and describe this, because I know you were really, integral in leading a lot of these meaty discussions.
So with this, as I keep saying, I like playing with things. I like solving problems. And I find the first thing you do when you brainstorm is the spaghetti at the wall kind of idea. And so when you got people in a room saying, oh, what could we do? You get lots of ideas. And so it was really fun saying, oh, yeah, I hadn't thought about that. I hadn't thought about that. Or I've tried that before and it worked. Or I've tried that before and it didn't work, but this is a different student population. Maybe it'll work now. And so as we said, we don't know really the specifics of what worked really well. We've got some survey data from the students, qualitative about what they liked. But in general, what we did is we embedded both success coaches and tutors into these. And so the success coach is a person who is in charge of kind of the more affective issues. Just how is it going? Are you struggling? Are you okay? What about study skills generally? And so we had those that we could rely on. And we also had some tutors that were actually able to tutor subject wise. And so having those was really interesting. I've had one and I've had another, having both, having it in different classes. So you had these wraparound supports that was, I think, pretty helpful for the students. Also, we were pretty upfront. They knew what they were registering for, that this was a new thing. They had lots of surveys that they completed before. They also surveyed them during, and then some of the post stuff. And so I think that kind of helps some of the students also know that they were engaged in the process that they were going through. Anytime you can involve the students within the thing they're doing, they're going to be better at it. Also from the instructor side, we wanted to make sure that we were presenting our curriculum in a way. We would try to theme focus it initially. Oh, we're going to have a cohort. Let's all have the same theme. We can work together. Obviously, that cohort thing kind of broke down a little bit with the reality of registration issues. And so we ended up with mixed classes. Some of them were actually together. Some of them were not. Some of them were traditional students. And so we couldn't theme it as much as we wanted, but the instructors were aware that we shared students. And so we would try to adapt for those individual students if possible. Oh, yes, I know you're taking the speech over here with Amanda. I'm doing this assignment. It would be cool if you tied them together. Like just them knowing that that was a possibility is something I never know with any of my normal students. or regularly enrolled students. And so having that awareness on my side was a cool outreach moment. We had a lot of conversations about how we presented assignments. This was an online class, and so you have a lot of online best practices, but a couple of us were trained in UDL, Jana, myself, Stephanie, which is Universal Design for Learning. And so we really try to emphasize what could we do to support students in understanding the tasks required. And so we had video directions for all of the assignments. We gave video feedback, making sure that we were present virtually for office hours so that the students knew they could reach us, even having on-campus hours if they wanted to come in, even though it was an online class. There's a lot of discussion about personal emails and texting and calling them so that they knew we were reachable. And also that if, Amanda, if a student missed 2 classes in a row of her, she could reach out and like, hey, has that student missed your classes? I'd be like, yes. And like, oh no, we both should text this student. And so having that kind of cross course knowledge of the student experience was really powerful. So that was some of the supports we offered them, and also some of the instructional strategies that we were trying to develop across the cohort for everybody, to both adjust the learning environment itself, but then also help the student with the supports outside of the curriculum.
I think those are all great examples. And I just want to share an insight that one of our faculty members, Stephanie Kratz, who taught the literature class, really tuned into. And this was right about when we did the first learner survey. And it was something that she just noted. She teaches online regularly. And one of the insights that she had was that having all early childhood students in one class, she noticed that the online learning environment, and it might have been this particular group of early childhood students, these unique learners, but that the technology, there were some adjustments to the technology initially. And so because the success coach was a part of our cohort at our meetings and our discussions, who is just fantastically responsive and has their own lens to bring to things, the idea that what about having intrusive supports initially around technology, and whether it is specific to this unique group of learners, whether it's specific to, whether it can be generalized to learners in a particular pathway, or whether there are 1 or 2 learners in any online class, in any learning pathway who might benefit from this. This could be a best practice for online classes that could be adapted. So really kind of thinking about things both specifically and broadly was one of the kind of the interesting things that came out of this.
It was fun. When a class that I shared with Amanda, the speech and the English ones, I think we both had a grandmother. She was a working grandma, so she was doing all the family things plus school. And then we had this fresh out of high school student. So you had the gamut, as you guys have in any of your ECE classes. But it was fun because they were both working towards the same thing. And so in the online discussions, you could try to play with that and get them to see it. But the technology issues was really surprising, especially for some of the older non-traditional returning students. Like, we hadn't thought about how much extra support they might need just to navigating some of the regular stuff that our traditional aged, fresh out of high school already are familiar with. Another thing that we were kind of surprised by from those surveys was how many classes these people took. They were working full time, they had families, and they're like, I'm taking 3 classes at night. And my brain was just like, poof. Like, that is, 2 full-time jobs plus your family. And so there's this realization for some of them, and they might not have realized the amount of work required per class. And how could we get that information to them up front to know, like, wow, 1 class a semester is actually really fine and good and will get you where you need to go. Maybe take 2 in the summer, just those kind of stuff that maybe a fresh out of high school student would be more familiar with. It was the returning students that I think took on too much. And so just 2 little things from those during semester surveys that were really powerful.
So, the last line was thinking about assessment design. So one of the things, and these are examples within the context of early childhood. And one of the things that, you know, again, looking across the learning pathway in a deep and meaningful way, was kind of that redundancy of skill assessment. And, you know, Zach, I so appreciated your emphasizing the idea that there are some skills that need to be repeated again and again and again. And of course, we all know that. And then there are some skills that we repeat over and over and over again, perhaps unnecessarily, right? Or sometimes because maybe it's a little bit easier to write an assessment that way, whatever the case is. So we did a lot of design work around where is it really meaningful to have an assessment that is turned in via writing? And, you know, again, these are very UDL concepts. And where does the assessment to be aligned with the competency, where is writing not suggested? And so the idea that if we're looking at identifying here, this is a basic assessment of where you're just identifying basic ethics. Just fill in the word because it's not going to come to me, but it's a drag and drop exercise. And so as opposed to writing out all the definitions, we changed this to a drag and drop exercise. This next one is looking at foundational theories in early childhood, and then looking at the kind of skill that's being measured. It's a very foundational skill. Here, they can really interact with something where they're more just filling out, they can just click on. So obviously writing is an important skill, and I'm not just saying that because Zach is here, right? But the idea that particularly when we know for a group of learners that they're developing writing skills, do we need to tap into these over and over while they're developing them? Can we show them can we provide alternative opportunities for them to demonstrate their knowledge and skills while they're developing proficiencies in other areas? So that was something that I think looking across the curriculum really supported as well, in terms of where they're being introduced to particular skills and where we're requiring particular skills within the context of the early childhood curriculum. So we wanted to talk a little bit about some next steps and where we are in thinking about prior learning assessment in the context of English. And I already forgot Marcus's quote. I think I blocked it out. Zach, what was it? Extremely difficult something for Jen.
Very uncommon.
Very uncommon. So here goes. So we wanted to talk a little bit about what we're thinking about with English and PLA exploration within the context of immersion, some broad campus conversations. And we wanted to just talk about over the course of this project, just system implementation connections, potential challenges. And, you know, the word challenges just means, you know, anytime there's change, like the begets, you know, I already talked about how Sarah Dean, for example, you know, all the heavy work around a whole new enrollment process to get those cohort members in, for example. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Zach.
So building assignments across courses is just so much fun and very messy, and you have your individual level conversations. So John and I sat down and we talked through what you see here on the slide, and that's really well and good for us, but then trying to scale that gets really difficult, and it involves a lot more people and then a lot more systems and processes and procedures. And so it is challenging, and again, that's not a bad thing. It's just a statement of facts. People get involved, people have specialties, they have expertise that can point out something that I don't know because I'm just a teacher, right? And so none of this is bad. This is all good. I like challenges, I like playing, I like pilots, because you can do anything you want. It's so wonderful. So what we did here is with immersion, Jana, is it fair to assume everyone's familiar? We don't need to explain how that works.
I think so. Is that correct?
Okay, cool.
Okay.
In my world, on my side of the hall, everyone's like, wait, what? Virtual reality, what? So you guys know, it's really cool. And so what we did is we took one of those, I don't even remember what they call it, one of those
Scenario.
scenarios, thank you. And we looked at the scenario and said, okay, what are they doing for ECE? And this was related to our outcome matching. In this scenario, here's what they're assessing. Here's the rubric that immersion is using to assess that thing. And so we sat down and I said, wow, that actually is really close to what I would do in my writing class anyway. And so here, what you've seen is a draft that we created trying to say, could immersion be used to assess two things simultaneously for both classes? And it was a really fun experiment to think about the real world. Any of the people over here at State Farm, you might have one manager, but your product is being reviewed by multiple departments. So you have lots of eyes on the same thing. And this was just, again, real world application. Here, we looked at, okay, in a scenario, they were told up front what the scenario was going to be, which means they actually had to prepare something to come in to give in the scenario. Well, that assessment stage, their preparation, they knew who they were preparing this thing for. And then as a writing teacher, I could take that thing that they prepared and look at it. It's no different than a homework assignment where I say, go off in the next 2 days, write this thing, bring it back to me, and I assess it. The other part of that scenario, which was really fun, was this in situ observation. And so as the person is in the scenario acting this out, they are taking notes for themselves to then turn into the teacher maybe, or for themselves to know how to interact. Well, part of the writing process is brainstorming, is taking notes, is active reflection. And so that also would be a product that could be assessed by a writing teacher. And so even though the scenario itself is designed for an ECE experience, the products that they are producing could be used to assess an English 101 learning outcome. And part of the fun of that assessment design is we were going back and forth trying to figure out, is there a writing task that a writing teacher can look at? And of course, we're dreaming, saying, oh, they have to give a presentation. How cool would that be if it was a speech teacher was then assessing the presentation they were giving in the scenario? And so you can see, I think there's a lot of connections where a live experience could be looked at by multiple people for multiple purposes in multiple classrooms. And so this little box that we made about the artifact from the ECE world, who it was aimed for, and then what learning outcome from English 101 does that correlate to? And so this isn't duplicative assessment. This isn't the repetition, because in ECE world, Jana is reviewing that product for something. As an English teacher, I'm reviewing that same product, but I'm looking at it from a different perspective for a different thing. And so that is a necessary repetition, I would say, as opposed to an unnecessary redundancy. If we're both looking at it for the same thing, there's no reason to do it. Hope I explained that okay.
That was great. Do you want to go to the next slide, Zach?
Sure. And so some of the potential challenges that this whole thing kind of gave to us was, again, scaling. And so we had this pilot, we did this thing, you get a bunch of passionate people who are engaged and active in it, and you can work wonders. Then you have to bring it out and sell it to other people. And the first thing we found was moving to another department was like, I felt kind of like the guy running in going, oh my gosh, this is amazing. You have to do this. And then they're like, whoa, what is going on in the world? Like, just, you have to remember you're dealing with different people in different departments, and you have all of this back history that you have to bring and catch them up to, and then listen to their expertise about any potential roadblocks or problems that might arise, and then tweak accordingly. But you have to do that many times because there are so many areas around the college. And this is a good, and it's a fact of a bureaucracy. Records people know records and how the records will articulate. We need to listen to it and understand it, advising how to get the students in, the curriculum committees. So we have two. We have the Curriculum and Academic Standards Committee, and we have the Assessment Committee. So obviously curriculum and assessment go hand in hand. They need to be involved. So there's just so much that goes into it beyond just the little pilot of us kind of creating in our own little sandbox. Now, challenge, but there's a lot of opportunities there, I think, to get people to see how something like this could make their jobs easier and actually reduce the workload over time. So again, selling this to them in a way that's meaningful to them. The same thing goes with cross-department communication and perspectives. And so that's what's fun about sitting in a room with a Soc teacher, literature, composition, ECE, is everyone's got a different thing. And talking to Psych 101 about, hey, you said you have this writing assignment. Let's look at that. And is that something that I could use in my class to assess a writing outcome for me? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. And that's okay. But having that conversation is really important. Using evidence. So that's kind of where we're playing right now, is we've got the raw totals. That's how I think of it in my English world. It's like we just have the base numbers, but trying to tease out what of all those things that we did actually was helpful versus what was just kind of nice versus what maybe actually was an impediment. And so trying to tease those out to know how to move forward for the next round. And that's where the experimentation that John was talking about comes in. Related to kind of departments is also people's just kind of working processes and procedures. And so our lives are crazy complicated with lots of situations and lots of people. And so we develop processes sometimes for simple CYA, but other times because it's a necessary process to make sure someone gets what they need to get. And having the ability to work with people to say, oh, this is a thing you need for this really important reason. How can we adapt to that necessary thing? And that's a conversation that you have to approach in a certain kind of way without making someone kind of defensive and without overwhelming them. And I think that's the last bullet point too, which is there's challenges and there's excitement, and having us be super excited and going to someone else and presenting this idea, we have to get across our excitement and how valuable this is and meaningful for the people we're trying to do this for, which is the students, without overwhelming them and making them like, here's another initiative that I have to deal with, when we can say, this is a good thing and here's why, and here's all the people we're working for. This isn't just an isolated thing. So lots of opportunities here, lots of challenges that any project has to go through and reckon with.
I think that's so well described, Zach. And the only thing I'll just really briefly add is, just how much Zach and I, with our communication, the idea that like, okay, communication, this message is one that, I'll just give a really concrete example. Talking about avatars would send conversations this way, so the idea, like, how can we talk about this without, staying on focus, without going into avatars really go on, because then we would always go off into some other thing as opposed to this specific message. So it's just been an incredibly interesting process. So with that, we'll ask if anybody has any questions, comments, insights from your own institutions that you would like to share. I'll try to turn on stop sharing, but as I said, I'm having some screen issues.
I am curious about how close are we to having English as part of immersion? I mean, I don't know if have you guys actually done that?
Yeah, we piloted. We've had one student go through the immersion scenario and actually do the text products. I received them without a name. They were anonymized from Jana. She reviewed them, gave them to me. I passed them off before I even looked at them to 2 other English teachers. And then we came together and reviewed them with our kind of normal Englishy minds and rubrics. And it was incredible. The student that went through just blew us away. It was the amount of work they did for the scenario. You could tell it was something they were passionate about, they were knowledgeable of, and it was just like, this is so cool. Unfortunately, we haven't had any others to follow up that single student, and so we can't say, obviously this is a hard yes, but it's definitely something that Bojana and I really believe in. And that one student was just, it was gangbusters. It was really cool. So it demonstrated the potential of what it could do.
That is awesome. And I'm wondering, was this, did they write about early childhood? I mean, was that the focus?
Yeah, and so that's the previous slide that we did with the
That
prep
one,
work.
yeah.
Yep, and that's exactly what they did.
Okay.
They were said, okay, you have to present this learning plan to a parent. And so they had to write a
Awesome.
learning plan. And then the English teachers, we got the learning plan and we're looking at this and we looked at the research they used in the learning plan. We looked at the writing of the plan itself. We then looked at the reflection that they wrote after they did the scenario immersion, where they had to talk through their own processes. Like,
Yeah.
so it was a as real life thing as if I walked over here to the child development lab and sat down with a teacher. It was really cool. It was really exciting.
So in other words, they did immersion separately and then went on to do the English part after.
So the
I
student,
mean, the ECE immersion, like for the 15 hours. Yeah, yeah. Okay.
They submitted an artifact related to it. And so what we need to do institutionally, as Zach mentioned, we need to collect a variety of data. And then the process that he described of having two other English faculty review it,
Yeah.
so the idea that we could demonstrate that this is a standardized measure, and ideally we will get there, in terms of being able to sample. We were hoping to sample people who had passed English 101, people who hadn't taken, just a variety of different samples, and collect broad information on that.
Yeah. I just love that. I think that this regular immersion is so great because it rewards people for their experience, and I think adding the gen ed, like an English in there, is just awesome because, like you said, Zach, they did so well on this. And a lot of these students, I think, are intimidated, like by English and communicate, comm and all that, but they're actually doing it in their jobs. And so it makes them realize too, I can do this, so anyway.
So Zach and Jonna, are you saying that at the same time they proficiencyed out of the ECE competency, they also proficiencyed out of an English competency or an English class?
so we did
Because
not,
I like that what you're saying too, because they're doing a lot of writing, so you're assessing their written work for English.
correct.
So they're getting credit for English. I'm trying to understand.
So that's the kind of end goal. That's the dream pie in the sky, is with this immersion assessment, they would be able to get credit for those two classes. The student
A
that
class versus a competency. I'm just trying to understand.
understand. So in English 101, we don't have it in the CBE world yet. And so it's either a class credit or no credit. So I can't grant partial credit for English 101.
Neither can I. Okay.
Right. So that's dream number 2. We'll do that one in later. But for this one, we were saying, okay, if they did these things, we could give them the entire credit for English 101 class. And based on the
Ooh.
one student that we have seen, I am just confident that that is a thing that could be done. We haven't done it yet. This is not a thing at Heartland. John and I are working in our ways to try to get that moving forward. But the student that went in did not receive credit for it. They were just a pilot student of how would
Okay.
this work in practice.
Okay.
And the one thing that I'll add is that it's the immersion assessment, but Zach wrote artifacts in addition to that, that are tied to the ECE immersion assessment, but he wrote additional artifacts to measure the competencies that are in English 101. So I just wanted to highlight that.
Okay. That's awesome, actually.
It's exciting. Other comments or questions?
Jonna, let me ask you a question. Are you using the immersion technology to evaluate the ECE competencies? Are
Yes.
you doing that yet? Okay. Can you talk
Yes, we
to
have
us
been.
about how that is working with you? So you are giving them credit for what?
So Zach gave an example earlier of Child 239, for example. Child 239 is a modularized version of what is the Child, Family, and Community course. And so learners could potentially earn competencies that contribute to the level 2 courses. And so we have had, I believe, 15 learners go through and have earned I think an average of 6 to 7 competencies that have mapped into our modularized courses. It's been a very smooth process. We have individuals who are trained as assessors who do the assessment. They received an incredibly thorough training and work within Go React, which is a system they speak incredibly highly of. And the learners who have gone through the immersion assessment speak very, very highly of the process.
Okay. How does that look on your transcript?
That's a great question. So the immersion looks on our transcript. So I'm not an assessor. I assign the credit. So I've tried to keep those two processes separate. And so the process that we use, I fill out the just Heartland's institutional form to assign credit that's tied specifically to the modularized course that they've earned credit for. And it shows up on the transcript as other credit. So they get full credit. It shows up as other credit with no grade assigned to it.
And other credit. So 1 credit, 2 credits, 3 credits. And it's not the whole course though.
Well, so I will say yes to what you just said. In one case, if it's the 3 credit hour course, in some cases it is 1 credit hour course, and in some cases it's a 2 credit hour course. And Marilyn, to answer your question, with our modularized courses, they might earn, for example, 1 part of the Child, Family, and Community course through immersion, and then they have the opportunity to take the second part of the course. So they fully get that credit, but they can add the level, I believe it's level 3 competencies, that second part of that course, if they elect to.
So it's variable credit, right?
Well, no, it's assigned credit. It's assigned credit. It's not 1, 2, 3 or hours. It's that some of the modularized courses are 1 credit hour courses, some are 2 credit hour courses, and some are 3 credit hour courses, but they're not 1 to 3 credit hour courses.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. So apologies if I didn't explain that clearly.
You probably did.
I don't know. I haven't been tending to my coffee real well, so it might not have.
It is a Friday. My brain's kind of mushy at this point too.
Other comments or questions? And thank you for those. Well, we're super grateful for everybody carving out their time. And if you have any other questions, please feel free to contact either of us with those. And it was just wonderful to see you all on this Friday. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the forum. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank
And just
you.
as a reminder, please go back to the main session. And if you would like, you can keep your cameras off, and then we'll start that in a little bit.
Thank you.
Bye.
Oh, good. I just stopped